I'm very pleased and happy that I can welcome these three lovely panelists here on the discussion. First of all, of course, Anri Sala, who sits in our middle. Anri is a visual artist whose work has received a lot of critical acclaim ever since the late 1990s, with his early works being still in a documentary style. Videos that often in a metaphorical way explored the post-communist condition in his home country, Albania. Over the course of the years, Anri has substantially moved forward, articulating his skepticism towards language in a more explicit way by films that actually renounce the spoken word and instead embody music and sound as their core elements. In the last years, Anri has focused a lot on classical composition, the most prominent example of which until now has probably been Ravel, his project for the French Pavilion at the last Venice Biennale 2013, which actually showed two interpretations of Ravel's concerto for the left hand in a double projection. The Present Moment, the project that Anri has developed upon our invitation here for the Middle Hall of Haus der Kunst, for the project der Öffentlichkeit von den Freunden Haus der Kunst, is in a way a continuation of themes and topics that Anri has started to explore with Ravel. And at the same time, I would dare to say that the Present Moment unfolds a musical complexity that probably has no comparison in his oeuvre until now. Good. This evening we will talk about the present moment. We'll do so in a minute, but before I do so, I would like to introduce also the other two persons who are sitting with us on the panel. And I must say that we were very lucky to be able to work with the Münchner Kammerorchester on this project, who from the very beginning were like partners in crime for Anri's ideas on the realization of the present moment. To my right sits Bridget McRae, who, as Marco just said, is solo cellist at the Munich Chamber Orchestra since 2003. Apart from her duties at the MKO, she has contributed to numerous festivals. I will read the names: to the Rheingau Musik Festival, the Pharos Festival of Contemporary Music, the Prague Spring International Music Festival, and the International Musicians Seminar Prussia Cove. She has performed for several chamber music recordings, amongst others for the BBC, for the Bayerischer Rundfunk, and for the Deutschlandradio in Berlin. And I think it's really amazing to say that yet as a child, she had her debut as a solo celloist with the Victoria Symphonic Orchestra for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting. Bridget has won numerous prizes and awards, and we were very proud and happy that you agreed to be part of the lead sextet of the present moment. Many of you might have seen Bridget in the film, in the installation, but also, as Marco just said, on the poster and the banner, where we see the beautiful profile of Bridget. And then, last but not least, on the far right of our panel is Alexander Liebreich, who since 2006-2007 has been the artistic director of the Munich Chamber Orchestra, and he's probably most known to us in that function, but of course his outreach is far broader than that. From 2011 until this year, he was director of the Tongyong International Music Festival in South Korea. And since 2012, he has been the director and the chief conductor of the Polish National Radio Symphony Orchestra in Katowice, where you had the pleasure to just inaugurate your new philharmonic building installed by Nagata Acoustics early in October this year. Before and beyond the Münchner Kammerorchester, Alexander has collaborated with orchestras such as the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra, the Osaka Philharmonic Orchestra, and many others. I would say Alexander is really exceptionally interested in thinking beyond the borders of classical music and really looking for a cross-disciplinary exchange, and therefore couldn't have been more ideal a partner for the present moment than anyone else. I'm not sure if all of you have seen the installation, The Present Moment, yet, so I would suggest that that's maybe what we start with. And I would like to give the word to Anri. The starting point of this installation is a classical composition. It's a chamber sextet, string sextet piece. It's the Verklärte Nacht by Arnold Schoenberg. It's a piece from 1899, from the still late Romantic period of Alexander Schoenberg. And I wanted to ask you, Anri, whether you could maybe explain in how far this piece was the starting point and what you did for the piece and why you decided to bring this piece to Haus der Kunst in the first place.
In a way, I arrived to the piece by thinking about the space. And at the very end of the project, also for me, the idea is that the piece becomes a means to show the space instead of using the space and the means to show the piece. And in the very beginning, I was interested in all the possible contradictions. So I was interested in the idea of the chamber music, which is, in terms of the architecture, makes one think of a small space. Chamber music being based on the idea of conversation, where there is no a leading role, where there is not a conductor, and this versus a space which is very much architecturally but also acoustically. It's a space which is not based on the idea of the conversation, but is more based on the idea of one direction speech or event or communication.
Which is of course also a historical given. So basically, with bringing a chamber music piece, you brought something to the architecture that is really not made for, but also ideologically, in a way, contrasts the architecture.
Exactly. And then from this idea of using, of working with the chamber format, then I moved to the idea of how one can set in the space a chamber music, so that it produces a fiction where it feels like it's traveling through the space, and then it starts accumulating at the very end of the space, as if there was a dead end, as if there was a cul-de-sac. And little by little, step by step, I started thinking, also in collaboration with Olivier Guanard, with whom I've been, who worked on the sound designer, started thinking about what are the means from within the music that can carry it to the other side of the space. And this is how we came to the idea of using all the notes that represent new tones in the score, based on the principle of the 12-tone composition, which is a principle that 15 years later or so Schoenberg himself would introduce in the world of Western composition. And so in that sense, it joins another idea which I start becoming interested already with the projects Ravel, and Unravel, which is how it is to take a cultural product, an artistic product like a piece of music, consider it like a document of its own time, and take it by the hand, like travel it towards its own future, and see what will happen to it, what it will meet on this course. So in a way, for me, it was displaying it in a space and working it in such ways that Verklärte Nacht starts crossing the space and things happen to it. And to cut it a bit shorter, it would be like what would happen to the Verklärte Nacht if one somehow rearranged it, although I don't think it's the right word, in the name of Schoenberg to come. So looking at the earlier Schoenberg through the perspective of a later Schoenberg.
Yeah, maybe we take it one step back because this is, I mean, it's a really abstract concept of the piece, but I think it really unfolds very beautifully in the installation. So the installation consists of several separate soundtracks, the starting point of which is the original composition Verklärte Nacht by Arnold Schoenberg, a very dramatic composition based on a poem which is a love story. And this very dramatic expression can be found in the composition by Schoenberg through a very complex chromatic shifts within the composition. And then we have several following stations, so to say, in the exhibition. You've been mentioning a very crucial one, which consists of or which is represented by 4 monitors in the exhibition for speakers. And these are tones extracted from the original composition. So everything else that you will hear in the space is intimately related to the original composition, but it comes in a transformation. It comes in a new reading or in a different form. And what you did is basically, as you said, is to apply the 12-tone logic of Schoenberg, which says that a composition should be made out of a series of the 12 tones on the different 12 chromatic levels, whereby the same tone can only be used once all the other tones have been played. And that is basically how you came to this idea of using the new tones to travel through the space. And then in the end of the space, we have a kind of a serial reading of this piece where these new tones are being repeated. And at the very end of the installation, we have an extraction, which is yet another extraction, which consists only of all the D tones in the composition. So various readings of one piece. We do have a structure that is both time-related and spatial. And I think that is really the interesting part about the installation insofar as music comes with a time-based logic, but you're giving a spatial logic to it. And maybe you could explain a bit how you relate or intersect those two in the installation.
Well, there is a way how the piece progresses in time, in its own timeline, measure by measure, but also how it progresses in the space, and how in the space we have these different scores, 2 scores at once very often, that are somehow knotted together. So they are all the time, they are somehow in sync or slightly one ahead of the other, but they are connected in such a way that although they sound differently, they are still related to the same present moment in Schoenberg's original score. What happens at the end of the space with this accumulation of all the new tones that have traveled across the space is that we have this moment that interests me from the very beginning, where a note that has arrived on the other side, it's repeated until it's replaced by the next new tone who has crossed the space. So we have this feeling of something being stuck and repeated, and then suddenly it's given a go and moves a bit further in the. So we have moments of Schoenberg that surface in this repetitive situation. And this connects me also to some, when I said that this idea of having a piece of document of its time and how you make it travel across the space, and it meets processes or procedures or developments that only later occurred in the history of music or history of the human society. It's not only from a composition point of view, the idea of atonality, 12-tone composition, serialism, but also from the idea of the choreography, the idea of, like we see at the very end in the film with all the repetition of the notes, which is each time a gesture on its own right, and that somehow from the beginning, to me, it connected with the idea of division of labor, and the specialization, because the film, for example, is only specialized on the D tone. So each of the members of the sextet, they are playing only that one tone. So this is like a piece, a document of its time that travels across, that meets musical procedures that were to happen only later, but also what happens to it are choreographies that we only associate to later on in the history of development of the human society.
I think maybe this is the point to ask a question to Bridget, because Bridget, you were actually one of the musicians that executed the different scores that Anri and Olivier had developed together. And as you had been pointing out, Anri, to this issue of labor, I think it's really important to stress that every single note that we hear down there has been performed specifically for this installation. So there's no such thing as a digital construction of this piece, but you really insisted on this aspect of this very laborious process of really going through the processes in a very physical way, through all the processes of the installation. Bridget, I remember when Anri first told me about his ideas for the present moment, there was a great clarity conceptually, and at the same time, I really had a very difficult time imagining how that actually could work in execution. How was this actually for you as one of the musicians who was in charge of translating these ideas by Anri into the physical present of the sound or the music being performed?
Well, it was very much a process for us in the sense that we didn't quite know what was going to happen before it started. We didn't have all the information we needed until we sort of got there. And although we had the scores, it still wasn't clear from the scores what it was that we were actually supposed to do some of the time. The original was clear. That was something that we did very well. So that was easy, let's say. Although there was some indication there that we shouldn't do certain of the rubati that we normally did, that it should be a little bit less romantic than we perhaps were used to. And then I think one of the most difficult scores was this one in D. There was a second one in B that we did, which is not being shown here. Anyway, they both had a similar problem that which was really hard for us to grasp, was that you just stay in one action and completely disregard the dynamic changes from the original piece of music. And that was actually quite challenging for us, because it was hard to get, to know the piece so well, to get it in a way out of our minds and get into the more abstract, just mechanical action that Anri was looking for. And but I think finally when that clicked, that was, it was, then we got into a kind of rhythm with it, so that was not a problem. The other one, which was really challenging, recording session, unbelievably exhausting, was the one with the 4 speakers, because we had to, for many of the notes, there were 4 players, like 4 cellists, let's say, for the cello recording, that had to play the same note one after the other, da 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 da. So when you hear it down there, that's 4 different people. That's not a digital reproduction. It's actually 4 people, just to get this action, which is not a normal one for an orchestra. We normally play together, which is also challenging. But this was just so difficult, and but I think it sounds amazing. But it was hard for us to even imagine that it could come out so well. So this was, for me, the worst session. I mean, I'm glad that it sounds so great, but yeah, it was very draining. And,
maybe just an impression. I assisted just one of the sessions with the violinists of the T-score, and Anri, your idea was basically to translate the sound traveling in the space to the situation of the recording, in the sense that the musician were playing as if the tone would be proceeding by 5 meters, basically, more or less the distance that we have. And then with the violinists, we really faced the problem that Daniel started playing, and Max had to start playing before he heard the tone. Before the acoustics of the tone had arrived in his location, he had to start playing in order to give this feeling of the procession in the space. So it's I found it an incredibly interesting moment to assist in this recording of the music, to see how the spatial logic and the time-based logic really collapse in this piece. So I think it's really important what you just said, Bridget, how challenging that is to play as a musician.
I think it was, definitely it was very difficult and very challenging, and in an interesting way, I remember when Alexander was conducting this, and we would, after each moment of a note or of a section of notes being played, we would be looking at each other, because it was very obvious sometimes what worked, what was there. So beyond all the concept, all the challenges, there was always this moment which made it very clear that that was it. And then we could move on to the next passing by node, to the next traveling node.
Yeah. Alexander, basically we had the first meeting together with you and with Florian Ganselmeier, whom I greet there in the back from the Münchner Kammerorchester, talking about this potential collaboration between the Münchner Kammerorchester and Haus der Kunst for Anri's project. I had the feeling that you sensed very naturally what Anri was after. How did you understand the ideas that he had, and how did it translate for you? You assisted an early recording session, recording a simulation session basically that Anri and Olivier did in Berlin. How did this work for you?
The first approach was the communication with Anri, and for me, Anri kind of explained this thing to me, and basically I didn't understand anything. But I understood I would like to work with Anri, because I found it very interesting how he transported that to me. So I tried to work into the whole thing about basically having music, transfiguring the music or transporting the music, and having a new state of music, and then having this correspondences. Still, because I think I studied in this hall for 8 years, because it's the same hall as the Musikhochschule, we struggled always with the acoustics. So I was always pointing that out from the very beginning. It's a fantastic idea, but how to realize it, how to make it that people can really accept this idea. So that was basically, I think, my function in this thing, because I'm not a conductor, so even these reactions we had to do, I could give some impulse, but what was more important for Bridget or for everybody was just to judge with Anri if it works, because the single players in the corners, they react and act according to the other ones. What was for me, because Bridget just said it was so the worst section. I can understand, because you would like to get an energy playing together, and here it's just an energy playing just very short after each other. But in the end, it was like a book of these 4 players of the Munich Chamber Orchestras, very psychological, because it's not about me conducting, it's about they interact just one after the other. So they had to, it's a very social, interesting thing.
And interestingly, of course, that being something that is very crucial to chamber music and to the sextet, yes. I would say, in general. So just taking that to another...
And it's actually exactly the point, which is the point in music making, even if we play together, because how we act and interact. Because with the chamber orchestra, you're small, but then still sometimes the acoustic is different. If we would play a piece here in this hall, we would always think, when shall we play? We just did recordings with a symphony in a church. We have always to judge when to play, and you hear different. So basically the whole situation of an orchestra playing in an acoustic hall is always an installation, because there's not a real sound. What is the sound? It's by trusting each other, basically trusting. My function is a lot just to judge on that and thinking how this could be, and to translate then everybody what it is. So actually my function was it's not about the beat, it's about the impression.
Yeah, maybe it would be interesting for me to hear how you felt about these different translations that Anri and Olivier proposed to the original score, because I guess that's a great liberty that someone who does not come from the field of music is able to bring to the field of music, but which might eventually be a total taboo if you are raised within the field of music, in the sense of like applying a logic that Schoenberg has developed later on to an earlier piece of his. And I know, or before you said that Schoenberg is a structuralist and that all these elements are there. How was it for you to have this reading of the late Romantic Schoenberg through the 12-tone Schoenberg? Is that something that you had thought about before, or was that very natural to you? With the different stages in the exhibition on the different stations.
So I don't know if I understand it right, because I mean, Schoenberg still having a romantic piece is always a structural thinking person. And 12 tones are great when they are composed in a romantic way, because 12 tones have a relationship. The idea that 12 tones don't relate to each other is just a wrong idea. So the 12-tone system is just a system putting it after each other. But then the romantic music uses 12 tones. So for me, it's always about how tones interact. For me, when I do a 12-tone piece, I say, oh, there is a row. Oh, yeah, come on. So we just do the music, because an octava has a relationship. That's interesting, how the tones interact. And but I think for this installation, it was important also with the film not to have the effect of the musicians, just getting to the structure. Yeah. And during playing, but also in the visual thing. So I guess that was the idea of Anri, that he would not basically face the instrument and moving and say, okay, this is a kind of what we call how he interpretates the music. I have a big problem with the word interpretation, because I don't consider us as interpreters. But to make it more clear, what is the quintessence of the tones to each other? So. And still, I think the crucial point now in this acoustic of the whole was that all the layers which you considered in the beginning playing more together, because of the huge acoustic of this Lichthof, was not possible. So just to clean it up, to spread it more, even we considered 6 monitors for transporting. Now we have only 4, because the own volume of the hall is so strong.
Yeah, I think this aspect that you said with the undermining of like this gestural expression, that is really something very interesting. And just yesterday I read something that Richard Leppert, a musicologist, wrote, and that I found really interesting in terms of describing what the present moment does not do. And I quote him, precisely because musical sound is abstract, intangible, and ethereal, lost as soon as it is gained, the visual experience of its production is crucial to both musicians and audience alike for locating and communicating the place of music within society and culture. That is, the slippage between the physical activity to produce musical sound and the abstract nature of that which is produced creates an uncertainty that is ultimately resolved via the agency of human sight. In brief, music's visual performative aspect is central to its meaning. The point is, performers gesture. They do so, of course, simply in order to make musical sound, but musicians likewise gesture in order to make meaning, to visually inflect the sounds that they produce. And I think this is really one of the points where you basically stepped in, which is very visible in the video and in the score that is performed in the video, the D score, where the musicians are supposed to play only the D tones from the original Verklärte Nacht score in repetition as long as this D tone is replaced. Maybe a question to Bridget in terms of or just in general, you said you had a very hard time in the beginning to really reduce yourself, to strip away this D score of the original dynamics of the piece. Maybe you could answer very generally, what is the importance of the musical performance or of the visibility of the performance and the gesture for you in playing music?
Sorry. For me, the gesture is important, but must be authentic, and having to do with the production of sound or the emotion felt. But I'm not a fan of gestures that just are a show. So the gesture that's part of the music or part of the physical action, I guess that's for me an important one and one that has meaning.
Yeah, Anri, maybe you could talk about really the visual idea for the film, which is so closely related to the focus on the gesture.
The visual idea of the film relates a lot to two things. First, to what is happening, so to the choreography, to where the energy is, to what's the action in the film, and the action is, of course, also what produces instantly what is the soundtrack in the film. And the other thing was, to me, it was very important, is that first the camera, or when I say the camera, it means the viewer next time in the space, in the exhibition, is not on the side of the audience, but it's towards the back. So you approach the whole performance from the back. It also makes it very clear that this is not a performance, it's just a few people who are there together in a given space for a given reason, and they are playing together. Now, what this playing together means in the film, that was another thing, is that actually, to me, it was very important, and this is why it was also so difficult, like Bridget says, is that when a sextet are playing together, they affect each other, like Alexander said. While in my principle and the idea is that they are not playing with each other, they are playing with each other in Schoenberg. They are connected to Schoenberg. Whenever they play a D tone, it's because in Schoenberg a D tone was just played, was just sounded. So in a way, they are playing together with not with what is there, but what is not there. And this is what creates this autistic relation between the different members of a sextet. And I was very interested in this autistic moment, that everything in the show is very connected together, but it can only be very connected together as long as each of the elements is not too connected with itself. And the only thing which is very connected to itself is the original Schoenberg, because it was composed to be together. While in my vision of my idea of this piece was that all the other elements, none of them is there for itself. It's always in connection to something. So in order to be with something else, you have to be a bit absent-minded about where you really are, here and now. So this is that quality that I was looking for in the film, but also in the other position, what we call the B position. And I remember the first time that we were about to record the Schoenberg, the Verklärte Nacht, and because when you are working on a project, you have to anticipate what is coming later. And I said, do you mind playing the what we call the other score, where things accumulate, just for me like this, I know how it sounds, and I know. And they played it. And it was the first time you played it, the first time I heard it played by you, in that sense. And it sounded very beautiful, but it sounded absolutely not what was needed. Because so far you all received a score, the individual scores, you saw it, you rehearsed it a little bit with each other, you told me so. So you tried to make sense of it. So the whole thing sounded very beautiful. But it was just made sense for itself, in itself, because somehow you imposed on it this necessity to play with each other. And I didn't want you in the film or in the other position to play with each other, but to play with this instance of Schoenberg that is somewhere else in the space. Mm-hmm. So that's where this autistic thing comes in, and was very important, that this tunnel of choreography, of a movement, of a repetition of a note. That's one aspect. And the other aspect, to me, it was very important also not to film the instruments. And by not filming the instruments means that one does not film where the contact is being performed, where the bow touches the chord. And by not filming or representing an image what is the focus of the sound, but by producing focus somewhere else in the image. Therefore, very often in the camera, the focus is on the elbow, or is always in the furthest point possible. It is somewhere in the image, it's not an image out of focus, but it's always somewhere far away from where the sound action is happening, to produce something, an out of sync between the focus of what one sees and the focus of what one hears. And to me, that was also important because it's about filming the process that will convey the music. So this instant before the sound happens. So before the sound happens here, it happens on the score, it happens here, it happens here, it happens here, and then it happens here. So that's why I was very interested in filming the instance just before.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of what you said, I mean, you're filming basically the mechanics of the production of music in the human body. And I mean, you said that is this very, I mean, you bring them in this autistic and repetitive and very laborious mode. Maybe you could connect that to your thinking in terms of the piece traveling in time.
Well, the piece, any piece of music travels in time. There it's about the piece traveling also in space. And there is, I mean, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that there is a very strong sense of direction in music, like where the music is carrying you. So I was very interested in yet producing another contradiction, because, for example, what happens in the very last stage of the installation is in the film, which is meant to be the detones arriving there, the film is half a second ahead of the original score. So it means that there is a causality, meaning that we know very well that from the original Schoenberg, all these notes are traveling, are going there, but yet this there place, it's ahead of the original. But because it's factual, it's true. Like at the end of the installation, when we hear it, we hear that the film ends before the original Schoenberg ends. But still, because the musicians are constantly stuck, so to say, or in this limbo of recurrent gestures, we constantly have the feeling that the film is behind. Because something interesting for me and strange happens is that in the original tonal piece of Schoenberg, there are all these notes, all this tonality, there is progress. So we constantly have a feeling of going somewhere with the music. So it's progress, but it's progress which is still nevertheless later than the film. And in the film is ahead, but we have this strong feeling of stagnation. So we have a feeling of stagnation which is ahead of progress, but nevertheless we believe in the feeling of flow, in the feeling of progress, although it's quite later than the film in that sense. So there is a flow and a counterflow in that sense, so that we know that the piece is progressing in the space and is going from the beginning of the space towards the end. But on the other side, in the terms of the timeline or of the
factuality,
exactly. Yeah. It's what is happening in the end is ahead of what is being heard in the beginning of the space.
Yeah. You mentioned one thing that I think is really crucial, that the film shows something and by that it produces its own soundtrack. So there's a very close relationship between what you see, what you hear, between the conception of the piece, the content of the film, the form it produces, and the sound that we hear to go with it. And I mean, there have always been debates about the quality of what characterizes music, and often it is described that exactly this coincidence of the content with the form is one of the very special aspects of music and the advantage that music has over many of the other arts. And in that sense, it was said that art may be the purest of all arts, or the purest of all forms. And Walter Pater, a British essayist, said that basically all arts always aspire to the condition of music. And I'm wondering if, Anri, if you could bring that in a relation to your own work or your own interest in music. Does it have anything to do with exactly this consistency, maybe, of form and content? Or how did you come to classical music, maybe in particular?
Well, I mean, first I went to music through sound, and through sound, like you mentioned a bit earlier, also as having lost some trust on language as a means of communication. And this is what brought me to the sound, because sound is what is about to become a word or about to become music. And then from there I got interested in music, and then I realized that besides the other emotional qualities of music, music presents this quality of being in the present, where you do not have these strong structures of before, now, and later. or past, present, and future. So music is more implicit in that sense. It's where language is more explicit. And I am interested in this, in what is implicit, and therefore the music, instead of I'm interested in music and therefore I'm interested in things which are implicit. But then I would never make a separation between sound or image, or between film and music, because if you make such a thing, then you think film, music, then music is soundtrack, or it's film music. And to me, in most of the recent work, or at least in the last 10 years, the music is the action before it's the music. I'm interested in what produces the sound. And what produces the sound is this choreography, this action, which is constantly a negotiation of the next moment, of the moment which is about to come. And this happens so beautifully in music, and not necessarily in the same way when we speak, because when we speak, we stop, we think, we speak.
There's a lot of processing basically happening.
Processing. While in the music there is a continuity. Of course, it's tempos, and there are moments of silence which are very important. But yet, in music, silence is music. While when we speak, silence is silence. And the best example for this, in terms of my own work, is this project Long Sorrow with a saxophone player who was suspended on the outside, the 18th floor of a building in Berlin, and he's improvising. And because the music he does with his saxophone, it's not like it sounds like improvisation, it's real improvisation, in the sense that every moment he had to invent and propose to himself the following moment. Because the moment that you would have to play a score, then he would have time to think of, anticipate, but also think how bad his situation is, because he was suspended 80 meters above in the air. I mean, safe from objectively we could say safe, but the moment you are suspended in a void, subjectively you do not feel that safety anymore, however many tufts can be put on whatever connects you to the wall. So in that sense, that's very important to me, like this, keeping this tension and negotiating the next moment which is to come. And this is, I think, what has brought me close to music as a means to negotiate the present moment and the moment after. And then there is this, when I started working on this project, I was interested, and also, the first time I wrote a text about it, that we needed to have a small text. And I said I'm interested in the present moment because, and that's also in psychology, is the moment where the notions of past and the future do not arise. And in the way how it happens in this exhibition, but also in my thinking and my work, actually I'm more and more interested in that present moment where the notions of past and future are concurrently present. So they are constantly competing, who is the past and who is the future of this.
Actually you described very well in relation between the D score and anticipating the original Schoenberg score, although it derives from it.
For example.
So basically. Alexander, maybe for you to pick up on this idea of presentness in music and in classical composition when we have a scripted score. I mean, is that a concern, or this question of the now in music?
Yeah, I would like to add this. So my fascination, which probably is the same fascination, is like in which context music works, which has a lot to do with the timing. And you said about the music might be the purest kind of art, which works always, which has also a negative side. Thomas Mann said, music can be just a big prostitute because it always works in a lot of contexts. And this must make you aware in which context you make the music. So for me as a conductor, I'm anticipating the music, or try to. So I'm thinking before this music happens, how could it be sound? But not only the sound, it's like which players are where and in which state of moment they are in this, because they might need a cue, or they might need a picture, or they might need just a kind of glimpse of attention, or whatever. I mean, how to make an orchestra sound might be, for example, you have an orchestra in a hall and it doesn't feel good because you don't hear yourself. So you might go back and me or another musician might say, oh, it sounds fantastic. And then the orchestra sounds suddenly different. So this is a kind of a state of mind when this is. So also conducting itself, it gives an impulse, not on the music. So and then the acoustic, sometimes you have an echo from 6 seconds. So when is the music? I don't know when it is. I think it's when we get an impression or we think there is a kind of a picture. So that was basically the interest of this whole project, especially in which context you experience music and what is the transportation of music. So the conducting which Anri did for this installation is exactly this question, and it's not irritating. And what Anri just said with the film, which takes place half a second before the music, we tried it out on one of the first evenings, just exactly on the same moment, which did not work in a way because it's just a kind of a parallel happening, which you don't even hear it parallel, but it's kind of not good. So there is something before and after it. So that's exactly this phenomenon which interests me before the music should happen with an orchestra, and then still the listener has a different reception. So it's exactly this the idea of time, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that you chose Schoenberg, which kind of brings us into this discussion of the relation between visual arts and music. Not only because Schoenberg has painted himself or has been working as a painter, but also because he had a very close relationship to visual artists, in particular the Blue Rider group, and from that group Kandinsky, in terms of finding structural relationships between visual arts and music at the time. But independent of that, I would like to talk about the trajectory that Schoenberg himself has done or paved the way for in his compositions or in his musical development that you address basically in the installation. Adorno had a very particular liking for Arnold Schoenberg and for the new music. I mean, he's been writing a lot about the Neue Musik, and he stated that the study of musical change, for which Schoenberg was a prime example, was always already the study of social change, so closely relating changes in music with societal or cultural changes. And according to Adorno, with the Neue Musik, and in particular with the 12-tone composition as it was developed in the early 20th century, the paradigm of development and of expression within music had come to a halt. And Adorno saw this new music as a reflection of social reality, with what was perceived as the sonnet at the time being a reflection of its time. And Alexander, I wanted to ask, or maybe that's a question to both Bridget and Alexander, do you see this quality in music as well, in the sense that music is a product of its time and does reflect changes, culturally, society, in terms of society in music?
I think that we can, I'm not a music philosopher or anything, but I do think that we can very much see the connection, and also the music of the present time, how much variety there is, and which kind of reflects the explosion of different ways of living and thinking which exist. And everyone has their direction that they're interested in musically and in their life. And I think we have a lot of choice with the music from today. And I suppose those choices were a bit smaller in the past. The same that people also had less choice about how their life would unfold, the average person anyway.
Alexander, maybe you could help us to understand a bit, or define from your perspective what the changes were that propelled something like the development of 12-tone music? I mean, it's something that happened after the First World War. Did that play a role? Is that something that you would like historically connect to one another? Or what is for you like a historic context that made something such as the 12-tone music possible? I mean, it might be a very short-handed comparison, but...
it relates absolutely in a way. We just had a huge season with the Münchner Kammerorchester about 1900, which exactly reflects this time, and we try to figure out exactly this breaking time. I mean, as a composer, you are kind of restricted also from the outer world to evolution. So what can you bring new? So this new thing, which is always asked by a composer, and even have it with the orchestra. I mean, we have a lot of new pieces. We do first performances. We have commissions, and the orchestra would come up and say, "Yeah, not bad, but is it something new?" No, we have heard that. So to change and to make a process is a kind of a pressure on the composers. In that time, of course, the music was in the end of the Romantics, so it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the idea, just in the end, what music is about, we have 12 tones, but actually we don't have only 12 tones, because with vibrato we have already more tones. In other cultures we have more and more tones. So it was a kind of a system there, and so it was a result to go back and to see what the essence of an interval can be. Strange enough, looking at the different arts, music was always a little later than painters in a way. It's a kind of perhaps because music was always more dependent of let's say a big group, kind of entertaining theater, because we are basically, as musicians, we are entertainers in a very, very high sense, but we have to entertain the crowd. So that's why we're sitting in front there on a very high level. But some other artists which writing a book or would paint, so they could just perhaps get more. But music or orchestra music has always to do with bigger institutions who are in a way more conservative sometimes than other arts. That's I feel. So there is a kind of a time track between the music and other arts, but of course it does reflect. But in the end, the state of mind which is in the music does always reflect the same thing. So there are only 3 or 4 issues which is about love and death and war, or just the basic problems. So there is not so much more in the last centuries. But then the ingredients and the form does change, but the real point of music never changes. I think it's very, very clear, limited of that what moves us basically every day.
I mean, with the way how you've conceived of the present moment and all the different stages, which do not just stop with the 12 tone, but go more into minimalist music, for instance, let's say in the background. Considering that you're addressing so many of these changes, my question would be, what kind of society or cultural or historical context does the present moment speak about? Does it more relate to the times of Schoenberg and the development until the 50s or the 60s, or do you think it from the now? And if you think it from the now, how does it address issues that are relevant to you in this very moment?
Well, I mean, I could not really. I'm too involved in it to be able to say it's this and this and that, and a lot of the things are there by a process of intuition. Like I said, I think it musically speaking, one could speak of atonality, one could speak of phasing, which happens a little bit in the background, and serialism. So in terms of activity, one could, like I said, could think of Taylorism, division of labor. But then I'm very interested in what I said before. It's this idea of a certain alienation, but which is not just alienation, but it means that you are very close to something which is far away. In the same way that Bridget is playing what she's playing for a reason which is not within them there, the six of them, but it's connected to what Schoenberg is playing there in that position. So there is this a combination between autism and closeness, alienation and relation, and at the same time. So this goes further than just Fordism, Taylorism, factories, or etc. But then, to me, it's also important this other moment of its relation in the space with the viewer or the listener, the visitor, the wanderer, so the one who either stops and listens, gets interested, or cuts through. It's because having more than one soundtrack being played at once, somehow you have, it's like there are different things which are being offered. They are knotted together, they are completely connected, but nevertheless they are themselves in terms of the notes that they are playing. And somehow it's the viewer or the listener, the member of the one who is visiting the space, who is going through them and who is choosing his own music, he's choosing his own place and how it sounds at place. Because, for example, there is this, we're discussing these things a lot during the moment of the mixing. Also, Robert, who is here, who was the music producer of the different, and we're discussing about what one listens in the middle of the space, while in the middle of the space there are no speakers. So there is this moment when we hear Verklärte Nacht on one side, and you hear the accumulation of the 12 tones playing in repetition on the other side, but what are we listening in the middle of the space? So somehow everybody could choose, could become his own DJ of what one is to hear in a given moment.
And also decide what kind of cross-section or which narrative all of these different steps you basically produce through walking through the space, right?
Exactly. So that's to me, this is something which I think relates to issues of now, of today. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's also very important, this, which brings us a bit back to the exhibition, to the idea of the space, is not to produce a centrality. Now, I know that how dear is to us centrality, to have something that we hang on. In the same, perhaps it's as dear as probably it was in a given moment, the idea of tonality, something that explains the world, that produces a world around you. Or to me, it was very important to not go for that, having something which is in the center, that you can go around it and that produces a social interaction that to some extent we know because we have been interacting with it for quite some time over and over again. It was very important not to have centers, but to have different positions that offer sound or offer an experience, but nevertheless, the real experience is the one that each of the viewers and listeners does by choosing whatever is the trajectory that one takes.
Yeah, I think basically you've kind of mapped out how crucial or how seminal the space, and really also the space with its historical context in that sense, or in the case of the Haus der Kunst, is for this installation. Because, I mean, as you said in the very beginning, I mean, it's one of the first National Socialist building. It was meant to be unidirectional, it was meant to be frontal, it was meant to be hierarchic. And through exposing the space itself, through offering this decentralized perspective of the installation, you're kind of implicitly addressing all the issues that are inscribed in the architecture without talking about them. And I think that's really a very beautiful approach.
There is this one detail which was important to me, although it goes somehow slightly against what the film has to offer, which is the film is partly blocked by the two columns, and to me it was a choice which made sense to me, because first I wanted to show the only physically present thing in the work, to show it outside the space which was assigned to me, which is the space within the columns. But also it was for a very long time after the Second World War, like if one would flip quickly all the pages of the book of the history of that space. It was immediately concealed, there were walls, one could not see the columns, and then little by little there's been all this gradual process of coming to peace with the space, not with the ideology of the space, but with the physicality of the space. So suddenly, to me, it was very important now to make work where it's no longer the work that conceals the space, but it's even the space that conceals a part of my work. Mm-hmm. So that was important for me, why these two columns are there, somehow against the aesthetics of the film, because if I choose the film to be that, and that's how it will be shown, for example, in Zurich in a month, the other film on B flat, it was shown properly, like in the frame for which it was filmed. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's important this moment of also producing a certain frustration to the work itself, so that the space makes itself present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe before I open to potential questions, I have two last questions for Bridget and for Alexander. I mean, chamber music historically comes out of a context. It comes from the musica da camera, which means that it's made for a rather small space, for an intimate situation. Bridget, my question to you is, what is the ideal room for you to perform chamber music?
Actually, it really depends on whether it's a concert, for a big audience or small. And it's actually quite rare nowadays to have a real chamber music in a chamber, in a small space. So that's actually quite a difficult question. I think a place that feels intimate, even though it can be big, is somehow preferable, like Wigmore Hall in London, which is actually big. I mean, it has a lot of seats, I think 1,000 or so. But somehow, because it has a very intimate stage and a cupola above, and you really hear yourself, although you also hear the projection, and you feel the audience very close, because you're up on a stage, but it's not really high, and there's a warmth in that connection, and so I think that's the ultimate chamber music hall, let's say. But of course, chamber music can take place in all sorts of places, and it can also be very satisfying. So that's just like the ideal, let's say, but it doesn't have to be like that.
And Alexander, I mean, you come out of the experience of just inaugurating a new concert hall. Is there any such thing as a perfect space for performing music?
Yeah, it is a chamber music hall, the perfect hall, and I would not agree to the idea that chamber music is for a small chamber. Kammermusik, or we say like ein Kammermusiker, is somebody who is aware about what he's doing very much. So we have like Kammersänger, they have it's a kind of excellence, sign of excellence. A good orchestra, independent how big it is, needs to play like a chamber orchestra, which means to have awareness what the others are playing. Otherwise, a big orchestra doesn't work. So the very good orchestras like a Symphony Orchestra by Schoenberg, Berliner Philharmonic or others, they would be very good because they are aware what the others are doing. It's a kind of transparency. And a good hall might be huge, but have the sound of transparency and give that. I would like to add something else because of the idea of, yes, is that combine music with visual art. I consider music itself and having a concert as a very visual art. I mean, not for no reason. I think the face of Bridget is on this poster. If I may say very personal, looking at Bridget playing, which is a very, very beautiful fact because you see the intensity and it's not the outer effect of making somebody. And I think that's why I guess Anri took Bridget's face into that, because it's not somebody just doing music, it's just like in between a kind of dialectic. It's not suffering, but it's also not happiness. It's just a total intensity of making music, which is an inner beauty. And this I also would like to see, not as a conductor, but as somebody being in a hall, watching an orchestra playing in this intensity is a huge visual impact. In difference to listening to a CD, and then you just. But I think that's the truth of a concert, is a visual art.
Okay, thanks, Alexander. I think that is a beautiful closing word. Good. I think we need to hurry up if you want to see the next and last performance for tonight, which starts in 10 minutes. So thanks a lot, Anri. Thanks a lot, Alexander. Thanks a lot, Bridget, for being here with us. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.